July 14th, 1982, 9:47 p.m. The summer night was heavy with humidity, the kind of still heat that clings to the skin long after sunset. Crickets sang in the tall grass, and the distant hum of a lone highway echoed faintly across the quiet fields outside town. On this night, nothing seemed unusual, until it did. A car sat idling on a narrow county road, headlights casting pale cones of light against the darkness. Inside, the engine ticked faintly, but the driver's seat was empty. A purse lay on the gravel just beyond the open door, contents spilled in a scattered arc, lipstick smeared, loose change glinting in the dust, a diary left half open to a page of hurried handwriting. The clock on the dashboard glowed green, marking the minute, 9:47. After that, time itself seemed to stop. Neighbors later recalled hearing a dog barking furiously somewhere in the distance, then silence. Others claimed they noticed nothing at all, only learning days later that something terrible had unfolded in their midst. But the clues were there, if anyone had known to look. Faint footprints pressed into the roadside dirt, leading away from the car, vanishing into the tree line. The air carried a strange emptiness, as though the world itself held its breath. No sound of struggle, no cry for help, just absence. In those moments someone, a daughter, a sister, a friend, ceased to exist in the ordinary world. She was there, and then she wasn't. The purse, the diary, the car still running, these objects became eerie relics, frozen in time. The kind of details that investigators would replay endlessly, trying to stitch together the final seconds before she disappeared. How does someone vanish from a well-traveled road without a trace? Why did the engine keep running, headlights cutting across the dark, while the driver was nowhere to be found? The questions hung like fog over the town, unanswered, unsettling. When deputies first arrived, their flashlights swept across the scene, beams catching the metallic gleam of keys still dangling from the ignition. They took photographs, marked tire tracks, logged the abandoned belongings into evidence bags. But for all the procedure, the one thing they needed most was missing: the girl herself. Hours turned to dawn, and the scene grew even stranger beneath the pale morning light. The purse still lay there, now damp with dew. The diary's ink had begun to blur at the edges, yet no sign of her footsteps returned to the car. They ended in nothingness, and with the rising sun came whispers, parents drawing their children closer, locals trading worried glances at the diner. Something had happened here, something that shattered the illusion of safety this town had always carried. One moment, it was just another quiet summer evening. The next, it was the start of a mystery that would haunt generations. Because from that night forward, her absence became a constant presence, a shadow at family gatherings, a silent headline in old newspapers, a ghost in the corners of the town's memory. The car, the purse, the headlights, and then, nothing. For the next 4 decades, that silence would haunt investigators. Before she was a mystery, she was a person. Her name was spoken with warmth in the hallways of her school, whispered with affection by her younger siblings, and etched carefully in the corners of a diary that held the everyday hopes of a 17-year-old girl. She was not just a victim, she was someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone who believed in tomorrow. She had grown up in this small Midwestern town, where every face was familiar and every street seemed safe. The kind of place where neighbors waved from porches, kids played barefoot until the streetlights came on, and nobody thought twice about leaving their doors unlocked. In the summer of 1982, the town seemed caught in a bubble. Long evenings at the local drive-in, Friday night football games under bright lights, and the hum of cicadas rising with the heat. For her, life was just beginning. Teachers remembered her as bright but restless, eager to chase something larger than the narrow borders of her hometown. Friends described her as the one who laughed the loudest, who danced without caring if anyone watched, who dreamed of moving to the city to study art. Her room reflected the contradictions of a teenager's life: sketches pinned beside posters of bands she adored, makeup scattered next to textbooks, a Polaroid camera always within reach. Tucked beneath her pillow was a folded letter she had never sent, written to a boy she liked but was too shy to confess it to. Her family carried their own memories, her mother recalling the way she hummed while doing dishes, her father describing the determined set of her jaw when she practiced for track meets. To her younger sister, she was both protector and tormentor, the one who borrowed clothes without asking but also the one who whispered reassurances after nightmares. It was this girl, with her dreams, her imperfections, her ordinary beauty, who became the center of a story that would fracture the illusion of safety that blanketed the town. That summer, the town had felt timeless. Farmers tended to their fields, the diner buzzed with chatter, and on weekends the streets filled with families buying ice cream and teenagers cruising in cars with the windows rolled down. In the evening, porch swings creaked and radios played softly from open windows. It was the kind of place where everyone thought they knew each other, where danger felt like something that only existed far away, on television screens. No one could imagine that by the end of July, they would be taping posters of a missing girl to telephone poles, that search parties would trample through cornfields with flashlights, that the girl who had once been the very embodiment of youth and freedom would become a question mark no one could answer. Neighbors later said they remembered her last day vividly. Some recalled her at the diner, laughing with friends. Others thought they saw her on her bicycle that afternoon, hair catching the light. A friend remembered a quick hug goodbye, never thinking it would be the last. The town, with all its warmth and routines, would never be the same again. What had once been a safe, predictable world suddenly felt fragile, vulnerable, because while she lived in the pages of diaries and the memories of those who loved her, within hours, she would vanish, and the town would never feel safe again. The night of July 14th began like so many others. A summer evening stretched long and slow, cicadas buzzing, the air thick with the warmth that lingered even after sunset. For her it was supposed to be a night of laughter, of friends, of nothing more dangerous than the winding country roads that crisscrossed her small town. 9:12 p.m. Witnesses would later testify that she was seen leaving the diner. She walked out with two friends, the glow of neon lights painting their faces as they stepped into the cooling night. She was laughing, her voice carrying across the parking lot, carefree and bright. She said goodnight quickly, keys jingling in her hand, before slipping into her car. 9:20 p.m. A clerk at the gas station down the road remembered her stopping briefly. She filled her tank, paid in cash, and smiled politely. He would later tell police nothing seemed unusual, nothing out of place. She was just another teenager on another ordinary night. 9:36 p.m. A neighbor claimed to have seen her headlights pass along County Road 16. A flash of recognition, a wave of familiarity, and then she was gone. That sighting would become one of the last verifiable moments of her life. From that point the timeline phrase, her car was found at 9:47 p.m. idling on the narrow roadside, the headlights cutting through the dark. The driver's door stood ajar, her purse lay spilled beside it, lipstick and coins scattered like breadcrumbs. The diary lay open, pages rustling faintly in the night air, but she was gone. Deputies reconstructed those final minutes over and over. Did she pull over for someone she knew? Did the car break down? Was there a struggle, swift and silent, that ended in her disappearance? The scene gave little away. Footprints in the dirt veered toward the tree line, shallow impressions fading into the underbrush. They ended abruptly, as if the earth itself had swallowed her whole. Tire tracks crossed the gravel, impossible to distinguish from countless others that had traveled the road before. A neighbor recalled hearing a dog barking wildly around that time. Another swore they heard a car speed off. Yet no one called the police then. No one realized a crime was unfolding in real time. The sheriff's office pieced together a fragmented timeline. A teenager leaves a diner, fills her tank, drives down a familiar road. Minutes later, her car is abandoned, belongings scattered, and she is gone. It was a disappearance with no witnesses, no clear struggle, no explanation, and so investigators asked the haunting question that would echo for decades: how does someone vanish from a lit road, from a car still running, without a single soul seeing what happened? The night air, thick with crickets and humidity, gave no answers, only silence. By dawn the car had become a symbol of dread, an object photographed, studied, analyzed but never able to tell the full story. The headlights had burned through the night until the battery died, a mechanical reminder of a life interrupted. Her laughter outside the diner was the last confirmed sound anyone heard from her. Minutes later, all that remained was a scene that looked both ordinary and impossibly strange. Footprints leading nowhere, headlights glowing over an empty road, a girl who should have made it home, but didn't. When a loved one doesn't come home, the first hours feel endless. For her family, that July night stretched into a dawn of panic, disbelief and dread. Her mother woke before sunrise, noticing the silence of her daughter's empty room. The bed was untouched, the window open to the heavy summer air. At first she clung to excuses. Maybe she stayed at a friend's house, maybe she had gotten tired and slept in her car. But by morning those fragile hopes collapsed. Her daughter was missing. The call to police came just after 7 a.m. The urgency in her mother's voice carried through the static of the sheriff's line. She didn't come home. Something's wrong. By 8 a.m., deputies arrived at the house. They asked the routine questions. Had she ever run away? Was there trouble at school? Could she be with a boyfriend? But the answers didn't match the facts. Her purse, her car, her diary, all of it was abandoned on that desolate road. She hadn't just wandered off. By mid-morning, the case shifted from concern to alarm. Officers combed the roadside again, pushing through the underbrush with gloved hands, scanning for fibers, blood, or any trace of struggle. Volunteers gathered in clusters, taking instructions from deputies. Farmers opened their fields for search parties. By afternoon, helicopters circled overhead, blades chopping the air as spotters scanned the landscape below. Posters were printed at lightning speed. Her smiling face, copied onto hundreds of sheets of paper, began appearing on telephone poles, convenience store windows, and school bulletin boards. Neighbors passed them out on street corners, whispering to each other, "How could this happen here?" The sheriff held a press conference on the courthouse steps that evening. Behind him, deputies shuffled nervously as flashbulbs cracked the silence. He promised every available resource, every deputy, every volunteer. But beneath the official words, a current of unease rippled through the crowd. The girl had been gone nearly 24 hours, and no one knew where she was. By the second day the investigation swelled. Police radio chatter filled the air, call-ins of supposed sightings, tips phoned in by frightened citizens, reports of strange cars seen along the highway. Each lead was logged, each one pursued. None panned out. Detectives scoured the diner where she'd been last seen, questioning waitresses, cooks, her friends. They combed through her locker at school, searched her bedroom, collected her notebooks and letters. Every detail became a potential clue. Every word she had written was analyzed for hidden meaning. But the hours slipped by, and with each passing one, hope thinned. Statistically, investigators knew the brutal truth. The first 48 hours were critical. After that, chances of recovery dropped sharply. Her father, pacing outside the sheriff's office, clung to the image of her return. Her mother sat at the kitchen table, staring at the phone, willing it to ring. Siblings huddled in their rooms, whispering questions the adults couldn't answer. Despite hundreds of eyes scanning fields, despite helicopters overhead, despite the desperate prayers of an entire community, nothing surfaced. No body, no sign of life, no trace at all. By the close of that second day, the town faced a chilling realization. It wasn't just that she was missing, it was as if she had been erased. In small towns, fear spreads quickly, and in the summer of 1982, fear settled over this community like a storm that would not pass. At first, neighbors left their porch lights on a little later, just in case. Parents told their children to come home before dark, their voices sharper than usual. But as the days turned into weeks with no sign of the missing girl, caution hardened into paranoia. Doors that had once stood unlocked for generations were bolted shut. Curtains were drawn earlier in the evening. Teenagers who once lingered in parking lots and fields found themselves confined to living rooms, watched carefully by parents who no longer trusted the safety of their own streets. Rumors began to run wild. Some whispered of a drifter passing through town. Others swore it was someone local, someone who knew the roads too well, someone hiding in plain sight. Every unfamiliar car drew suspicion. Every stranger's face was studied. Neighbors who had known each other for years began to look twice, wondering silently, could it be him? The local paper ran headline after headline, splashing her photograph across the front page. Where is she? The bold print asked. Week after week, editorials spoke of the need for vigilance, for unity, for answers, but the more coverage appeared, the more the silence underneath seemed deafening. Candlelight vigils lit up the town square, families gathered with flickering flames, singing hymns, holding hands, praying into the summer night. Her school friends stood in clusters, clutching each other, staring at the empty chair she should have been sitting in. Teachers spoke quietly about her absence, but their voices betrayed the same fear that lived in every adult. Gossip filled the diner booths and grocery store aisles. They said they found footprints. I heard the FBI's been called. Someone saw her in another town. I swear it. Each rumor rose, swelled, then collapsed into nothing, yet each one carried weight, adding to the cloud of suspicion that smothered the town. Some residents claimed to see her in the faces of strangers. Reported sightings came from bus stations, shopping malls, even as far as neighboring states. Police chased them all. Every lead went cold. Meanwhile, her family's grief deepened into something raw and consuming. Her mother's eyes grew hollow, her father's shoulders slumped under the weight of unspoken guilt. Friends left notes on her locker, tied ribbons around trees, refusing to let her memory slip into silence. And then, the unthinkable happened. Weeks into the search, hunters stumbled across a body in a nearby county. The discovery sent shockwaves through the town. Had the search ended in tragedy? Was this their girl? Families crowded around televisions, as local stations interrupted programming with grim announcements. For a few harrowing hours, the community braced for confirmation, but the victim was not her. It was another young woman, unknown to the town, but close enough in age and circumstance to deepen the terror. The realization cut sharp. If one girl could disappear, and another body be found, then perhaps a predator was moving among them. Perhaps safety itself had been an illusion. From that point, the town lived under a shadow. Nights grew longer, whispers grew darker. The community, once bound by trust, now bound itself by fear. And still, the missing girl was nowhere to be found. Every unsolved case finds its keeper. For this one, it was Detective James Callahan. At first, the investigation was a team effort. Dozens of deputies canvassed the town, the state police lent support, and the FBI reviewed what little evidence existed. But as the weeks turned into months, most moved on to other assignments. Files were shuffled to the back of desks, leads dried up. The missing girl became another cold case. For Callahan, though the case refused to fade, he was a veteran officer, already hardened by years of crime scenes and false confessions. But something about this disappearance lodged deep inside him. Perhaps it was the image of the abandoned car, headlights cutting through the night. Perhaps it was the family, hollow-eyed and pleading, who reminded him of his own children. Or perhaps it was the sheer impossibility of the puzzle. How could a person vanish so completely? In the evidence room, he lingered long after others had gone home. Boxes labeled with her name stacked higher each year. Photographs, diaries, tape recordings of interviews. Each detail was studied, catalogued, returned, only to be studied again. Tape-recorded interrogations revealed the endless cycle of suspects. A boyfriend questioned for hours, denying he had seen her that night. A drifter picked up on the highway, grilled until his story checked out. A co-worker with a shaky alibi, released after polygraph tests, proved inconclusive. Each time Callahan thought he might be close. Each time, the evidence crumbled in his hands. Notebook after notebook filled with his looping handwriting, timelines, theories, maps of the county roads with red ink circles. He carried them everywhere, even to his daughter's school plays, flipping pages, as if the answer might leap out when he least expected it. Colleagues whispered that the case was eating him alive. His desk became a shrine to it. Photographs pinned to corkboard, a map with strings connecting sightings, the girl's smile staring back at him day after day. He chased down every rumor, every supposed sighting. One lead sent him to a remote farmhouse at midnight, another to a gas station 3 counties away. Each time he returned with nothing but exhaustion etched deeper into his face.
Yet he refused to let it go. To outsiders, it seemed obsessive. To Callahan, it was duty. He had promised the family answers. He had promised himself he would not stop. But obsession has a cost. His marriage strained under the weight of late nights and unanswered calls. His health faltered. Friends said he looked older each year, as though the case itself had stolen time from him. Still, he pressed on. Through the 1980s, into the 1990s, Callahan pursued every thread. New detectives rotated in, tried their hand, then rotated out, but Callahan remained. Each theory collapsed. Each suspect walked free. The boxes grew dusty, and eventually the inevitable happened. The case turned cold, yet even as it officially faded into silence, Callahan still carried it, in his notebooks, in his restless nights, in the quiet corner of his mind, where the girls' laughter from the diner echoed endlessly. It would take decades, and an entirely new science, before the answers he searched for would finally come.
As the years dragged on, the case became a labyrinth of false promises and fading hope. Every tip that arrived carried the weight of possibility. Each phone call, each letter, each whispered rumor ignited a flicker of hope in the family, in Detective Callahan, in the town itself. But nearly all of them ended the same way, in disappointment. There were the psychics. They appeared on talk shows and reached out directly to police, claiming visions of where the girl lay buried. Some drew maps, others described shadowy figures, a few insisted they could hear her voice. Callahan followed up, despite his skepticism, walking through woods and fields marked by strangers' intuition. Nothing, not a trace. There were the jailhouse informants. Inmates desperate for lighter sentences spun elaborate tales of cellmates confessing to the crime. Detectives recorded hours of interviews, weighed each detail, but when cross-checked, the stories unraveled. Dates didn't align, descriptions contradicted, the confessions were fabrications, spun for leverage. There were men who seemed promising suspects, one with a violent past, another with a suspiciously timed alibi, a third who lived uncomfortably close to where the car was found. Each was interrogated, fingerprinted, photographed. Their names filled file after file, and yet every lead collapsed. Evidence didn't stick. Witnesses wavered, alibis held under scrutiny. The local press seized on each new development, fueling the frenzy. Headlines blared new suspect, questioned or breakthrough in missing girl case. But the excitement always dissolved into silence when those leads failed. The community grew jaded, weary of false hope, tired of reliving the nightmare, only to return to the same empty question: where was she? The family endured the cruelest cycle of all. Each time the phone rang, their hearts raced. Could this be the call that brought her back? Each time it wasn't. Friends described her mother's slow retreat into herself, her father's anger simmering beneath quiet words. Her siblings grew up in the shadow of her absence, measured by what she had been, what she should have become. Detective Callahan aged alongside the case. Photographs show his hair graying, his face hardening, his eyes carrying the exhaustion of decades. Yet he kept at it, even when others rolled their eyes at the newest so-called breakthrough. He clung to the case with a devotion that bordered on madness. But as the 90s turned to the early 2000s, the world moved on, technology advanced, new crimes demanded attention, and the girl's case sat gathering dust in a metal cabinet. Files yellowed, tapes warped, evidence bags stacked untouched. It seemed the trail had gone cold forever, yet inside one of those boxes lay the truth. Fragments too small to matter in 1982. Pieces of evidence that no one then could imagine might one day hold the power to unlock the case. The answers were waiting, buried in paperwork, sealed in plastic, forgotten in a warehouse. It would just take time, decades of silence, decades of grief before the right eyes and the right science would bring them back into the light. The case did not just grow cold, it froze. By the mid-1990s, the missing girl's photograph, once plastered on telephone poles, pinned to grocery store bulletin boards, and taped inside diner windows, had yellowed, curling at the edges. New flyers and posters for other children appeared, covering hers. A fresh generation of missing faces replaced the old, and with them the town's attention shifted. For the family, the silence was suffocating. Birthdays passed, holidays came and went, milestones ticked by uncelebrated. Her mother set a place for her at the table for years, eventually giving in to the unbearable emptiness and clearing it away for good. Her father visited the clearing, where the car was found, sometimes bringing flowers, sometimes just sitting in silence. He spoke little about it, but those who knew him said his grief hardened into something like stone. Detective Callahan, too, bore the weight of absence. Each anniversary of the disappearance, he revisited the case file, thumbing through pages, as if one overlooked clue might leap out. But every time, the papers remained stubbornly mute. He gave interviews that became shorter, more cautious, more clipped with each passing year. "We haven't given up," he'd repeat, though his voice carried the weary cadence of a man who knew hope was slipping through his fingers. The town itself grew quieter on the subject. At first people spoke her name in hushed tones, but as the years stretched into decades, it became a story told less and less. Newcomers barely knew it had happened. Children grew up walking past the spot where the car had been found without knowing its significance. The tragedy became a memory reserved for the older generation, fading like the paint on old storefronts, and yet silence does not mean forgetting. Beneath the surface, wounds lingered. Teachers still remembered her empty desk. Former classmates carried her absence into adulthood, telling their own children about the girl who had vanished. The community had not moved on, it had simply buried the pain under layers of time. Technological progress marched forward in the background, unseen and unconsidered. DNA science advanced rapidly, fingerprinting databases grew larger and more precise. Cold case units in other states began to revisit long unsolved crimes, some successfully identifying perpetrators decades after their acts. But in this small town, the case file still sat untouched in the basement storage room of the sheriff's office, waiting. Every so often, a spark of interest would reignite. A new detective might pull the file for review, a journalist might write an anniversary article, or a family member might make another plea on local television. Each time, the brief flurry of attention would dissipate, swallowed by the silence again. The hardest part for the family was not knowing. Without answers, grief never resolved. Hope and despair existed side by side, a cruel contradiction. Some days her mother convinced herself the girl might still walk through the front door. Other days she could not bear the thought that her daughter might be alive and suffering. The uncertainty was its own prison. This was the long silence. The years when nothing moved forward, when the world seemed to forget, when justice was suspended in limbo. But silence has a way of amplifying the faintest sound, and in time technology, paired with the persistence of those who refused to let go, would crack the stillness wide open. The silence lasted nearly 2 decades. Then, almost imperceptibly, it shifted. It began with a new wave of energy inside the sheriff's office. A younger generation of investigators had joined the force, detectives who had grown up hearing about the missing girl. To them, her case was not just a file collecting dust, it was unfinished business. Among them was Detective Sarah Mitchell. Unlike her predecessors, she was trained in modern forensic methods, where Callahan and his peers had been constrained by the limits of the 1980s. Mitchell carried the tools of the 21st century, and she was relentless. In 2004, during a departmental reorganization, Mitchell combed through cold case files. When she reached the thick binder marked with the girl's name, something inside her clicked. She read every page, studied every faded photograph, and pored over the property logs of stored evidence. The sheer volume of material shocked her. It was as if the case had been frozen in time, waiting for someone like her. What stood out were the small things: fibers, hairs, traces of biological material collected at the scene and preserved according to procedure. In the 1980s, they had been little more than curiosities, logged and stored with no way to test them meaningfully. But in 2004, DNA analysis had become powerful enough to read secrets locked away in those tiny fragments. Mitchell pushed for the evidence to be re-examined. At first there was resistance. Budgets were tight, labs were overloaded, and some senior officers doubted it was worth the effort. After all, how likely was it that anything usable remained after all these years? But Mitchell persisted. She worked late, wrote reports, made phone calls, and eventually secured approval. The evidence was carefully transported to a state forensic lab, where technicians used advanced extraction methods unavailable 2 decades earlier. Weeks later, the call came. A profile had been obtained, a complete DNA profile, clear, strong, and ready to be compared against national databases. It was the first real lead in over 20 years. The results stunned everyone. The DNA matched an offender already in the system, a man arrested years later for an unrelated violent crime. He had lived only miles from where the girl vanished. He was not one of the original suspects, though his name had appeared in the margins of early reports. Back then there had been no evidence linking him to the crime. Now the science told a different story. Detective Callahan, long retired by this point, was called and informed. Those who spoke to him said he wept quietly, saying only, "I knew she was waiting to be found." For the family, the breakthrough brought a wave of emotions: relief that progress had finally been made, anguish that it had taken so long, fear of what the truth might reveal, but above all, gratitude that the silence had finally been broken. The town too stirred from its long slumber. Old-timers gathered in coffee shops to discuss the news, while younger residents, many of whom had never even heard the story, searched archives to understand what had haunted their community for so long. For the first time in decades, the case was alive again. The walls of silence had cracked, and through the fracture came a flood of long-suppressed truth. His name was James Rowland. For decades, he had lived among them, mowing his lawn, waving at neighbors, attending church on Sundays. To most he was just another face in the small-town crowd, quiet, unremarkable, harmless, but the DNA told a different story. Rowland had been 31 years old the night she vanished. At the time he worked as a mechanic, known for his ability to fix nearly anything with an engine. He was married briefly, though the relationship ended in divorce, neighbors whispering about temper issues behind closed doors. He had brushes with the law, bar fights, disorderly conduct, but nothing that raised serious suspicion. In 1982, when detectives interviewed him about the disappearance, he had offered a neat alibi. He claimed he was home that night, working late in his garage. No one had been able to disprove it. Lacking evidence, investigators had let him slip quietly out of their crosshairs, and so he vanished into the background of the very case he had created. Now, with science illuminating the shadows, that carefully built facade crumbled. The DNA profile matched not only the fibers and biological material from the crime scene, but also evidence found on the victim's clothing. The connection was undeniable. Detectives began piecing together what they had missed. Rowland's garage, just 2 miles from the stretch of road where her car was abandoned, placed him within striking distance of her last known location. His work schedule gave him freedom of movement during the crucial hours, and witnesses, re-interviewed decades later, recalled seeing a man who looked a lot like him near the diner the victim had left that night. The revelation struck the community like a thunderclap. How could they have sat beside him at football games, bought parts from his shop, even trusted him to fix their cars, all while he harbored a monstrous secret? One neighbor admitted, "We thought he was just there, never threatening, never strange. If anything, he blended in too well." The betrayal was profound. The killer had not been some passing drifter, as many had long suspected. He had not been a shadowy figure lurking outside town lines. He was one of their own. For the family, the name brought both clarity and devastation. They remembered him. He had once been at a barbecue, standing just feet away from the girl's father. He had shaken their hands, smiled, even expressed sympathy when search parties came back empty. To realize that the comforter had been the predator was a wound almost as deep as the crime itself. Detective Mitchell described the moment she saw the DNA match. It was like the room went silent. This man had been right there all along, and somehow he had convinced the world to look the other way. With his identity confirmed, investigators began preparing the case. They dug into Rowland's past,
uncovering patterns of aggression, women who recalled unsettling encounters, and a trail of behavior that in hindsight should have set off alarms. But hindsight is cruel. In 1982, it had been invisible. In 2020, it was undeniable. The town braced for what came next: arrest, exposure, justice, and as detectives closed in, the truth of who James Rowland really was could no longer be hidden. On the morning of March 3, 2021, unmarked vehicles rolled slowly down a quiet suburban street. Inside, detectives checked their watches, radios crackling softly with confirmation codes. After nearly 4 decades of silence, the moment had arrived. James Rowland, now 70 years old, stepped outside his modest home, carrying a mug of coffee. His hair was thinner, his back slightly hunched, but his face was the same one frozen in the old town yearbooks, the same one neighbors had waved to for years. The officers moved swiftly. Within seconds, Rowland was in handcuffs, his coffee spilling across the driveway. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains as the man they had known for decades was led away, expression unreadable, eyes fixed on the ground. At the sheriff's office, he was placed in an interrogation room. Stark walls, a metal table, a tape recorder whirring softly. Detectives confronted him with the DNA evidence, the scientific certainty that bound him to the crime scene. For hours, Rowland denied it. He claimed contamination, false tests, anything to explain away the damning results. But the pressure mounted. Piece by piece they laid the evidence before him: the fibers, the clothing, the witness recollections, the genealogy trail that had led directly to his family line. The facade cracked, his voice faltered, and finally, after nearly 40 years, James Rowland confessed. The words were chilling. He admitted to intercepting her on that dark road, using the trust he had built within the community to disarm suspicion. What followed was brutal, senseless, a crime of violence and control. He offered no remorse, only resignation, as though the weight of the decades had finally crushed him into truth. For the victim's family, the confession was both a hammer blow and a release. After years of unanswered questions, they finally knew. They gathered in the courtroom months later, faces lined with grief and age, clutching photographs of the girl as she had been, young, vibrant, alive. The trial drew statewide attention. Reporters filled the benches, cameras crowded the courthouse steps. Inside, the prosecution presented the DNA evidence with clinical precision, weaving it together with Rowland's own words. The defense, weak and fractured, could do little to counter the overwhelming proof. When the jury filed back into the courtroom, silence hung heavy. The foreman stood, cleared his throat, and delivered the words the family had waited 4 decades to hear: guilty. Tears broke openly across the benches. Some sobbed, others sat in stunned silence, the magnitude of the moment pressing down on them. Rowland was sentenced to life without parole. He would never again walk free, never again blend into the community he had deceived. For the town, the verdict was more than punishment. It was vindication, proof that justice, though delayed, had not been denied. Outside the courthouse, the victim's brother spoke to reporters. His voice shook, but his words were clear. "We've waited 40 years for this day. My sister can finally rest, and we can finally breathe." Detective Sarah Mitchell stood off to the side, eyes wet but steady. She had carried the torch lit by those who came before her, and now the flame had done its work. The silence was broken, the truth revealed, but in victory, there was sorrow. Justice had come at a cost, decades of unanswered pain. The gavel had fallen, the courtroom emptied, but in the weeks that followed, the echoes of the case lingered like a shadow over the town. For the victim's family, justice was not the same as healing. They had carried her absence for nearly 40 years, shaping their lives around a void that could never be filled. Birthdays had passed without candles, holidays had been marked by an empty chair at the table, parents had gone to their graves without answers, and now, even with the truth finally spoken, nothing could restore what had been stolen. Yet there was a measure of peace. At the graveside service that summer, the family gathered again, not to mourn the unknown, but to honor the memory of the girl they had loved. They placed flowers beside her headstone, whispered prayers, and allowed themselves to imagine her no longer lost in silence, but remembered in light. The community too carried scars. For decades, fear had stalked their streets, whispers had filled their churches, and suspicion had torn at their bonds. With the revelation that the killer had lived among them, the betrayal cut deep. But over time, something else emerged. Resilience. Candled vigils turned into memorial scholarships. Old wounds became reminders of the strength it took to endure. And in the wider world, her story became a testament to the power of persistence. Cold cases once thought unsolvable were suddenly being revisited with new eyes. The same genetic genealogy that had brought down Roland would go on to solve dozens more cases, restoring names to the forgotten and justice to the lost. Detective Sarah Mitchell later reflected, "This case taught us that silence is never the end. Evidence doesn't disappear, it waits. And one day, with the right tools, the truth speaks." Her words resonated far beyond the county lines. Across the nation, families still waiting for answers held on to hope a little tighter, believing that science and determination might one day bring their own breakthrough. As for the town itself, the story of the missing girl became part of its history. Painful, yes, but also instructive. Memorial plaques were erected, not just as a tribute to her life, but as a reminder of vigilance, compassion, and the enduring demand for justice. The final image is not one of crime, but of remembrance. A quiet cemetery, flowers bright against the fading light, a town that has learned to carry both sorrow and strength, and a family that, though forever changed, can finally close a chapter left open too long. The truth had waited 40 years in silence, and when it finally spoke, it changed everything.